Okay, so we are moving now. We've covered chapter 5, chapter 8. We're now moving back into chapter 6 and chapter 7. Chapter 6 deals with interest rates and bond valuation. We don't spend much time at all on interest rates, the reason being that you talk about interest rates in other classes. So you talk about it in your econ classes and probably some of your other business courses. So I'll leave that to those classes. We're going to talk mostly about bonds. What is a bond? How do you use a bond in terms of investments? How do corporations use bonds? And that's what we're going to be doing over the next two chapters, chapter 6 and chapter 7. So this is useful not only from the standpoint of looking at how corporations can raise money, and a couple of ways they can raise money is one, they can issue bonds if they need to raise cash. Another is they can issue shares of stock, preferred stock and common stock, which will be chapter 7 if they need to raise cash. But also from an investor's point of view. You may invest in bonds. Some of you may already own bonds of some type. You may invest in stock. Some of you probably already own shares of common stock or preferred stock. And so we're going to look at it from both the corporation's point of view of raising money and the investor's point of view of how do you invest, how do you get started. When we get to chapter 7, I'm going to bring up my Scottrade account and I'll bring up the real-time streaming quotes, and so we can see an entire wall of stock quotes, and I'll go through with you how do you get started investing, how do you open up an account, what do you do if you want to buy, what do you do if you want to sell, that type of thing. And since this is a day class, that works really well because we can watch the shares actually changing price as we're looking at them. So you can see just the volume and the millions and millions of shares of stock being bought and sold every single minute. It's a really impressive process. But to get to that, we have to talk about bonds. So let's discuss interest rates really quickly and then move on to bond valuation. Now, when it comes to terminology, interest rates typically are applied to what we call a debt instrument. So that is something like a bond, which we'll see in just a minute. A bond is simply when a corporation borrows money from the bond purchaser. So they have to pay that money back. Just like if you borrow money from the bank, you have to pay that money back with interest. If we're dealing with some type of equity instrument, like we will in chapter 7, which means ownership, so we're talking about stock, then we typically talk about what we make on that investment in terms of a return. So it's not just a big difference whether we say the interest rate or the return, but if you're really getting technical about it, interest rates go with bonds and bank type products, returns go with stock. And again, we're not going to spend much time on this, but when we're talking about an interest rate and what we call an equilibrium interest rate, which would be simply the interest rate that is required on a certain type of product. So whether they're talking about a mortgage loan or a bond or a certificate of deposit at a bank, there is a certain equilibrium interest rate. So what rate should be charged or paid. And typically that's a function of these three factors. Inflation plays a role in that. Also risk. Of course, if we're dealing with something called a junk bond, which we'll talk about junk bonds in this chapter, that's going to have a higher interest rate associated with it because there's more risk as compared to maybe an investment grade bond. And we'll talk about investment grade bonds also. They have less risk. And then also, there are liquidity preferences. And so essentially, it refers to the general tendency of investors to prefer short-term securities. And typically that's how we operate as investors. When we want to invest our money, we don't like to tie it up for a long period of time. Now, when we borrow money, we want to borrow money typically for long periods of time. And so that's what banks and other financial institutions, that's the problem they're faced with, is their customers want to borrow for a long period of time, but their investors or their savers, their depositors, want to deposit for a short period of time. So how do they put together products that match up with those two contradictory ways of thinking? And that's a big issue for financial institutions. And then these are just some terms. You can take a look at these in your textbook, table 6.1. Different types of risk. As I said, finance has probably 100 different definitions of risk, and these are talking about default risk, maturity risk, and contractual provision risk. Default risk is probably the most prevalent here. It's simply the risk that a company will not make its interest payments on its bonds or won't pay the principal on the bonds. So just like if a person defaults on their car loan, which means they stop making their car loan payments, companies can default on their bond issues. They can simply stop making payments. And typically when that happens, bankruptcy is right behind. Okay, that's the first step into bankruptcy. Okay, now the definition of a bond. And this is kind of a two-part definition, but all of this is the definition of a bond. A bond is a long-term debt instrument used by businesses and governments to raise money. So that's the first part, and that's pretty simple. And I'm going to go back and talk about each of these in just a minute. Most bonds pay interest semi-annually, have a maturity of between 10 and 30 years, and have a par, or what's known as a face value, of $1,000 that must be repaid when the bond matures. So that is a bond. Now, bonds tend to be more confusing, I think, to most people than stocks, because we've heard of bonds, and some of you may have savings bonds that your grandparents gave you. Grandparents or older relatives to give savings bonds, used to anyway. But you may not understand, what exactly is this? What is this bond? First part of the definition. A bond is a long-term debt instrument. So when you see the term debt, we're thinking borrowed money. So a long-term debt instrument used by businesses and or governments to raise money. So we can have different types of bonds, we'll take a look at in just a minute. You can have corporate bonds, so bonds issued by corporations. So if, for example, Walmart needs to raise cash to build 100 new Walmart stores across the country, they have several options to raise that cash. One is if they have enough in terms of retained earnings, money they have set aside from past earnings, they can simply use that to build the factories or the stores. They can go to a bank and take out a loan to borrow the money. They can issue what's called commercial paper. Commercial paper is simply short-term unsecured credit issued by typically a very credit-worthy corporation. Another option is they can issue shares of stock. They can issue preferred stock. They can issue common stock, or they can issue Walmart Corporation bonds. And they can set these bonds up however they want. We said the maturity is typically between 10 and 30 years. So they can issue Walmart Corporation 10-year bonds that have a par value. Now, they don't have to be $1,000, although typically it is. They have a face value of $1,000. So what that means is when the bond matures in 10 years or 20 years or even 30 years, it's going to be worth $1,000. Now, the way it works is, as a bond purchaser or as an investor, if you purchase one of these bonds from Walmart, since Walmart's using your money, just like if you borrowed money from a bank, you have to pay that bank interest. Well, if you're buying a bond, you're letting the corporation or the government entity that issued that bond, you're letting them borrow your money. And so because they're borrowing your money, you're going to want them to pay you interest. And so typically they'll pay interest every 6 months or every year. Now, we'll talk about something in a minute called a coupon rate, and I'll explain why it's called a coupon rate, but that's also termed the interest rate. So they will electronically deposit to your account the interest payment every 6 months for the life of the bond. And if you own it until it matures, they're going to pay you interest every 6 months. And then when the bond matures, they're going to give you your last interest payment and the $1,000 par value that they originally borrowed from you. So a bond is a loan. That's all it is. But think of it as a loan in reverse of what you typically consider a loan, because typically we're the ones borrowing money. But a bond is when a government entity like the state of Kentucky or Callaway County or your local school system issues bonds, they're borrowing money from us. Does that make sense, kind of how a bond works? It's just a loan. That's all it is. And of course, there are different types of bonds. There are Treasury bonds. You see these in the news a lot. That's where our federal government sells bonds. These are typically very, very, very safe investments. And the reason is that they're backed by the United States government. And what that means is if you invest in United States Treasury bonds and they, for some reason, if the U.S. can't make payments, they can't make the interest payments of those bonds, or they can't pay the principal, probably the last thing you're going to be worried about is your bonds being worthless, because that means the government has collapsed. You may be worrying where you're going to get your next meal or where you're going to get your next gallon of water, and not what your U.S. government bonds are worth. Okay, so they're very, very safe. As a matter of fact, they're so safe that lots of other countries purchase our bonds, and we are very indebted to other countries. And if you watch the news very often, you will see that also. Corporate bonds, bonds issued by corporations. We talked about Walmart or any other corporate bond. Municipal bonds, these are also called munis. These are issued by state and local governments. So if the state of Kentucky needs to raise money, they can issue bonds. If Murray State University needs to raise money, they have several avenues through which they can issue bonds. For example, anybody who works out at our fitness center, which is not new anymore, but when I first started using this example, it was built through a bond issue. Murray State University needed some money. They, in conjunction with the city of Murray, went in. The city of Murray actually issued the bonds, but Murray State University students, through a small portion of their tuition payments, it goes to fund the interest payments and the principal payoff of the bond issue. So when that fee is tacked on to your tuition, you are actually helping to make interest payments on the bond issue that was used to build the fitness center. Now, the great thing about municipal bonds for investors is the interest payments that you receive on municipal bonds are not taxable at the federal level, typically at the state level and or the local level. So you don't pay tax on the interest income that you receive. Now, if you invest in a United States government bond like a Treasury bond or a corporate bond, when you receive interest income at the end of the year, you're going to receive something called a 1099 INT. So you're going to get it in the mail, typically in the middle of February. And it's going to tell you how much interest income you receive from Walmart bonds or whatever it might be. And you have to claim that as taxable income on your income tax. So you have to pay tax on it. With municipals, you don't have to do that. But because they're tax-free, typically municipals have a lower interest rate paid to the bondholders than do the other types of bonds. And then finally, we've got foreign bonds. Foreign bonds are simply bonds issued by foreign governments or foreign corporations. Some of them are very, very safe, very good investments. Others maybe not quite so safe. An example of an unsafe foreign bond might be bonds issued by the country of Greece. As you know, if you've turned on the business news in the last 8 years, you know that Greece is having a really, really, really tough time. Their economy is horrible. They've got terrible unemployment rates. And there is a lot of risk involved because there's a lot of uncertainty regarding if they can make interest payments on the bonds that they have issued in the past. And so what happens is, as we'll see in a minute, as bond prices go down, the yield on those bonds or the return to the investor goes up because you're paying a lower price for the bond, and so you're earning a higher overall interest return on your bond. Well, Greek bonds have dropped so much that they were yielding at some point in time almost 30%. So that's not a bad yield on an investment. You can earn 30%. Now, the problem with that is there's a large possibility that Greece might simply default on their bond issue. So you invested thinking you're going to earn 30% and you actually earn nothing. You actually lose all of your investment because Greece filed bankruptcy or went into bankruptcy. So if you look at U.S. government bonds, their yield is about 1%. very little risk. Greek bonds yield 30%, a lot of risk. So it really just depends on you and your level of risk aversion as to which ones you might want to invest in. But different types of bonds. Now, some key terms that you need to be familiar with when it comes to bonds. Some of these we've discussed already. The par value, this is what the bond pays when it matures. This is typically $1,000. But as I said earlier, it doesn't have to be. You can have bonds that have a face value of $100. You can have bonds that have a face value of $10,000. You can have a bond that has a $1 million value. The problem is most investors can't invest in a $1 million bond. They simply don't have the money. But most investors do have $1,000 that they could invest if they wanted to invest in a $1,000 par value bond. The coupon rate, this is a stated rate interest rate. And the way we determine how much it is, we multiply the par value by the coupon rate to get the dollars of interest that would be paid. It says here it's generally fixed. It doesn't necessarily have to be. You can have bonds whose interest rates change, although in this class we assume that they're fixed because it makes our life a lot easier when it comes to calculating the price of the bond. Now, the name, some people say, why don't they just call it the interest rate? Why do they call it the coupon rate? Well, the reason they call it the coupon rate is because before the days of computers, and bonds have been around for a long time, they've been used by lots of corporations and governments. When a company or a government, let's say a corporation, issued a bond, you would get something called a bond certificate. You actually got a physical piece of paper, and they were typically very ornate, very, they actually, you can still buy them. Go to eBay, type in bond certificates, and you'll find some old railroad bond certificates for sale. And a lot of them had attached to them literally coupons. Just like you would cut out a coupon in the paper, you would cut off your coupon, you would mail it to the bond issuer, and they would send you back your interest check. Now, that doesn't happen anymore because everything is electronic, but that's where the name coupon comes from. And it's just kind of stuck as what we talk about in terms of the interest rate. Now, there are some bonds that don't pay coupons, and the name is zero coupon bond. We also call these deep discount bonds. And the reason we call these deep discount is because you don't receive any interest payments during the life of the bond. You buy the bond at a deep discount from its par value. You hold the bond until it matures. And when it matures, the difference between what you paid for it and what the bond is worth when it matures, which is typically $1,000, is the interest that you receive on that bond. So just different types of bonds, okay? I mean, one's not necessarily better than the other. It just kind of depends on what you're looking for in terms of an investment or what a company's looking for in terms of having to pay interest. For example, with a deep discount bond, the company or the issuer doesn't have to make interest payments until the bond matures. But of course, they're not going to raise as much money when the bond is issued because it's issued at a much lower price or it's issued at a deep discount. So this kind of depends on what you're trying to accomplish. The maturity, the years until the bond must be repaid, we said this is typically 10 to 30 years. You can have 40-year bonds. Those are out there floating around in different places. The issue date, the date when the bond was issued, and the default risk, which we talked about earlier, the risk that the issuer will not make the interest and or principal payments. The principal is the face value of the bond. So there are risks with bonds. Now, let me say this about bonds. Well, let me say this about Chapter 7. You're going to enjoy Chapter 7 more than you're going to enjoy Chapter 6. The reason is bonds just aren't very exciting. As investments, they're not very exciting. As a lecture topic, they're not very exciting. I call bonds the vanilla ice cream of the investment world. And the reason I call it that is because vanilla ice cream is just not very exciting. You walk into a ice cream shop and there's 40 flavors in front of you. Vanilla is probably going to be one of the last choices that you make. There's a lot more, exciting ice cream choices out there. So that's kind of the stock market of those exciting ice cream flavors. But if you have a choice between vanilla ice cream or nothing, a lot of us would say, okay, I'll take the vanilla ice cream. And it's kind of hard to mess it up. I mean, vanilla ice cream is just sort of vanilla ice cream. It doesn't change much. That's kind of how bonds are. They're just kind of simple investments. They don't change much. They're not very exciting, but they tend to be fairly stable. And for investors who are conservative, who don't want a lot of risk, bonds are typically very good investments. Although we will see a little bit later, there are some pretty risky bonds out there. So you have to be careful when you are investing in government bonds, corporate bonds, whatever it might be. Okay, a couple of other things before we actually get into bond pricing, which come up next. When a bond is issued, as I said earlier, you can set up a bond however you want to because you're the issuer. Now, the thing is, the more complicated the bond, the less investors tend to like the bond, or the less investors tend to want to invest in that bond. Because they're thinking, okay, the bond issuer, they're trying to get something over on us, they're trying to take advantage of us, I don't really understand this, and so they just stay away from it completely. But there are a couple of provisions that are fairly popular and fairly standard in bonds that most investors understand, and that's called a call provision and then something called redeemable at par. So let's talk about each of these just for a second. A call provision says that the bond issuer can refund or buy back the bonds if interest rates decline. So what this means is, let's say I'm going to issue some bonds, and we're going to call these Lacewell Incorporated bonds. And I'm going to issue these bonds, and they currently have an 8% coupon rate. So I'm going to pay you, you're the bond purchasers, okay, of my bonds. I'm going to pay you 8% interest. Now, what happens is interest rates go up and down constantly. Every day, they go up and they go down. As we'll see in just a minute, when interest rates go up, bond prices go down. When interest rates go down, bond prices go up. So there's an inverse relationship between bond prices and interest rates. Well, what the call provision does is, if interest rates go down, let's say so that I issued the bond 3 years ago at 8% interest, but now interest rates have gone down, and I could reissue brand new bonds and only pay 5% interest. Well, as a corporation, I'm going to save a lot of interest if I can only pay 5% to you instead of 8%. So just like with a mortgage loan, when interest rates go down, people go in and refinance their mortgage. If they can refinance their home loan at a cheaper rate, they get a new home loan. Now, with a callable bond, I can simply let you, the investors, know I am calling the bonds, which means you have to sell back to me your bonds, paying 8%. And you may think, well, you don't want to sell them back to me because your bond's paying 8%, and if you have to buy a brand new bond, it's only going to pay 5% interest. And that's true. You're getting screwed on this deal. But you knew you were buying a callable bond. I am now calling the bond, and you have to sell it back to me. Now, because of that, I'm typically going to have to pay a little bit higher interest rate because I'm selling you a callable bond, and you're taking a little more risk. And typically, you're going to receive a small, what's called a call premium. So that means that instead of paying you back $1,000 when I buy back the bond from you, and I'm forcing you to sell it to me, I may pay you $1,050. You get that little $50 premium. But you're still not happy about it because you're having to sell a really good investment, and you're going to have to take that money and reinvest it at a much lower interest rate. So that's a call provision, and that typically hurts the investor, but it's going to protect the issuer of the bond. Because again, if rates go down, I can refinance my bond issue and save literally millions of dollars in interest. So a couple of terms here. Deferred call, that's the time until the bond can be called. So a lot of times if you buy a callable bond, there might be a 3-year period until the bond can be called. So you know that at least for 3 years, you're going to earn that higher interest rate. Or maybe it's a 5-year period or whatever it might be. And then there's a call premium. The other item that's included oftentimes in a bond issue is what's called redeemable at par. What that simply says is if the bondholder, that's you, can sell the bond back to the issuer, which would be me, for its par value. Now again, what I said was as interest rates go up, bond prices go down. So let's say that after you bought my bond that I issued, interest rates shot up really quick. Well, the value of your bond went down. So it's worth a lot less now than when you bought it. And you're thinking, you know, I could sell this bond. I could then purchase a new bond at a higher interest rate. But I'm kind of stuck because the bond price has gone down. But if the bond is what's called redeemable at par, you can simply contact me, the issuer, and say, guess what? I want to sell you my bond and I want my $1,000 back. I don't care what's happened to the market price of the bond. And I have to buy it back for $1,000. So in this case, this is protecting you from rising interest rates, but it's actually hurting the bond issuer, which is me, because again, I have to buy a bond that's worth less than $1,000 for $1,000. All right, and then a couple of, you can take a look at these later if you want to, just some other terms. And again, just some more terms there, so you can take a look at that. All right, so this is what I want to get to. All right, now if you have your financial calculator, you need to get out your financial calculator. We're going to be using what we learned in chapter 5 to value a bond. And that's why I said chapter 5 is so important, because one of the things that we talked about in chapter 5 was present value calculations, present value of a lump sum, present value of an annuity. So that's what we're using here in chapter 6 and chapter 7 to value bonds and shares of stock in chapter 7. Does anyone need to borrow a calculator? Anyone? Anybody else? Any other takers? All right. Okay, now this is, it says to value a 10-year, so it matures in 10 years, 10% annual coupon bond, so it pays interest one time per year. If the required return on the bonds, this R&D, this stands for the required return of debt, is 10%. So if we were to draw a timeline, this is what it would look like. So the bond is going to pay 10%. Now, it doesn't tell us the face value, so we assume the face value of the bond is $1,000. It pays a 10% coupon one time per year, so 10% of $1,000 is $100 in interest every year. So this is what it's going to look like. The first year, we're going to receive $100 in interest. The second year, we're going to receive $100 in interest, and that's going to keep going until year 10. And in year 10, we're going to receive the last interest payment plus the original par value of the bond, which is $1,000. Now, to calculate the price of a bond or the price of any asset, what we need to do is estimate the future cash flows created by that asset and simply find the present value of those future cash flows. So in this case, the cash flows associated with the bond, there are two of them. One is interest payments, and then the other is the par value of the bond. And we're simply finding the present value of each of these future cash flows. So you'll notice this, well, this formula is really messed up, but this is supposed to say 1 plus 0.1 raised to the first power. So this is simply the present value of $100 taken back one time period. We would do this for time period 2. So it'd be 100 divided by 1 plus the required return raised to the second power. So this is just a series of present value calculations. We've already done this, okay? So you already know how to do this. These are the present values for all of these 10, actually there's 11 cash flows, 10 interest payments and the par value. And if we add them together, it's going to equal $1,000. So this bond should be selling for $1,000 exactly. Now, with your financial calculator, it's just a little bit different than what we looked at in chapter 5, because in chapter 5, we entered 3 variables and we solved for the 4th. With bonds, you're going to enter 4 variables and solve for the 5th. So if you take a look at your time value of money row of keys on your calculator, there are 5 keys, so we're going to use all of them. We're going to enter 4, whichever 4 we have, and typically solve for the present value, which is the price of the bond. But it doesn't have to be. We can solve for any of the missing variables. So we're going to put in the future value, which is what the bond's going to be worth when it matures. N is the number of years or the number of interest payments left. Payment is going to be a dollar amount. It's the coupon rate times the par value. And the I/Y is what's called the required return. It is what similar risk brand new bonds are paying in terms of interest. Because as we said, interest rates change. And so over a 3, 4, 5, 6, 10-year period, bonds that are very similar to yours in terms of risk may be paying higher or lower interest rates. So we have to factor that in. So in doing that, this is the formula for bonds, and we're not going to be using this, but I wanted to show you the formula. So this is the present value of the interest payments, and this is the present value of the par value. And we're going to be valuing this bond. So this is the one that we looked at earlier. It says, and we'll look at a couple of different scenarios. Mills Company, a large defense contractor, issued a 10% coupon interest rate bond, matures in 10 years, has a $1,000 par value, and pays interest annually. So the question is, what is the value of this bond? So based on this, this is what the timeline would look like, where we're simply taking the present value of each of these interest payments. And then finally here, we're taking the present value of the par value when it matures. So this is the present value of the interest payment, $614.46. This is the present value of the par value, $385.54. If we add these two together, it's going to equal $1,000. So this bond should be selling, if we want to buy it today, for $1,000 exactly. And if we're using our financial calculator, these are going to be the inputs. So let me bring up my financial calculator somewhere. Okay. All right, now you want your calculator set on one payment per year. Mine's on 12. And then it was really important in chapter 5 to go through the clear process. In chapter 6, I mean, you have to clear out your calculator after every bond calculation. The reason being, you're using all of the keys that are listed here. You're either going to have an input for each of these, or you're going to be solving for the other one. So in this case, we have our 4 inputs for our bond valuation here. So I'm just going to, doesn't matter what order we put them in. I'm going to put in 10 as my N. My I slash, now this just says I, but this is the I slash Y, is 10%. So 10 I slash Y. The bond pays a 10% coupon, so 10% of $1,000 is a $100 payment. So I'm going to put in 100. Press the payment key. And then finally, when the bond matures, it's going to be worth $1,000 in the future. So the future value is $1,000, FV. We've got our 4 inputs. We don't have the present value, so we're going to compute. Press the compute button, top left-hand corner, the present value. And so this shows the bond should be selling for $1,000. And again, it shows up as a negative. So that means if we wanted to invest in this bond, it will be a negative cash flow to us because we have to take $1,000 out of our pocket and invest in the bond. So did everybody come up with $1,000? Okay, so it's pretty, I mean, again, if you understood chapter 5, then you're probably going to understand how to calculate the price of a bond. Now, this is in Excel, so if you're interested in doing it in Excel, it's got some really good bond valuation function. Plug the numbers in. Now, based on this and based on our bond, what this is talking about is bond value behavior. So this is saying, what happens if interest rates go up? What happens to the value of our bond? Or what happens if interest rates go down? So we can see that here in this example. So let me make this just a little bit larger temporarily. And on the left-hand side of the screen here, what's happening is interest rates have increased from, remember in the first example, they were 10%. But now, for whatever reason, interest rates have now increased to 10%. They've gone up. So what's going to happen is if you put this information into your calculator, now we can just change that one input. Okay, we don't have to go through, because everything else is the same. 10 years to maturity, payment of 100, future value of 1,000. So if we put in 12 as our I/Y and compute the present value, what you'll notice is interest rates have gone up, but the price of the bond has gone down. There's a negative relationship between bond prices and interest rates. And if you walk out of any finance class, that is one thing that you should walk out knowing, is there is a negative relationship between bond prices and interest rates. Now, let me ask you this. Why did the interest rate, why did the price of the bond go down to 886.90, well, 887? Because interest rates went up. Or we could look at this example where interest rates went from 10% down to 8%, and you'll notice if interest rates go down, the price of the bond goes up. Goes up from $1,000 originally at 10% to now it should be selling for $1,134.20. So I'll ask the question again, why would an investor pay $1,134.20 for this bond today when they know it's going to only be worth $1,000 when it matures in 10 years? You're losing money on that bond, at least in terms of a capital loss, because it's going from $1,134.20 to $1,000. So why would somebody do this? Because what? Okay, they could, but let's say you're going to buy this bond at $1,134.20 and you're going to hold it the entire time. You're going to hold it 10 years until it matures. There's one factor that the original bond, the original 10% bond has. What interest rate is this bond paying? Well, it's actually paying 10. But what's the market rate of interest? What if you bought a similar bond to this, but you bought the bond right now? The market interest rate's 8. So this bond is paying 2 percentage points more in interest. So even though you're paying a premium for this bond, when you pay more than the par value, we say you're buying the bond at a premium, you're paying $1,134.20 for this bond. The higher interest rate associated with this bond compared to market interest rates will make up for the loss that you have in paying a premium for this bond. Does that make sense? Kind of how that works? So your yield, the total amount that you earn on this bond, is going to equal exactly 10%, no more, no less. Thoroughly confused now?
Whatever it was on 10, you were buying bonds for $1,000, and then
It does. With this example, it works that way. Okay, but that's a coincidence. Okay, because this bond, let's say a bond pays a 7% coupon, so it may pay 7 times 1,000, which is $70 per year, and it could pay that for 20 years. So it doesn't have to be. Yeah, that's just kind of a coincidence. Now think about it another way. When we're looking at all of these inputs for a bond, there's only one input out of the 5 that can change based on what's happening to changes in the market. We can't control the bond's maturity. We can't control the interest payment of the bond. We can't control the future value of the bond, and we can't control market interest rates. But one thing that can change when interest rates go up or down is the price of the bond. And so to make this bond marketable to investors, the price has to change. Because in this example, if we go back to let's see, this one where interest rates went from 10 to 12, so the price of the bond went down to 887. As an investor, if I had a choice between paying $1,000 for a 10% interest bond or $1,000 for a 12% interest bond, which one am I going to choose if everything else is equal? I'm going to choose the 12% interest rate bond because I want to earn more interest income. So if nothing changed on this bond and interest rates went from 10 to 12, nobody's going to buy this bond at $1,000. So something has to give. And so in this case, the price gives, and the price is forced down to 887. So if I bought this bond for 887, I'm indifferent between it paying me 10% interest or paying $1,000 for a bond. Excuse me, is that right? No, it pays. Yep. 887 for this bond at a interest rate of 10% versus $1,000 for a brand new bond paying the market rate of 12%. Because the yield is going to equal the exact market rate of interest, no more, no less. So what this is saying is if our bond markets are efficient and we want to buy a bond and it's priced at 887, that's what that bond should be selling for, no more and no less. If the bond is priced at $1,134.20, that's what the bond should be selling for, no more and no less. So I want you to know how to, one, calculate the value of a bond, but also understand this relationship between bond prices and interest rates, which is shown here. So this is showing that, if we start out at 10%, the bond is selling for $1,000, we say the bond is selling at par. If rates, the required return goes up to 12, the price of the bond goes down. The bond is selling for less than par, it's selling at a discount. Or if rates go down, the price of the bond is going to go up, and the bond is selling at a premium. So you might want to mark this table in your book as good study material for the next test.
So when they got the interest, is the interest collected at the time it's calculated or until the very end?
The interest is, we're assuming that the interest is going to be paid. That's a really good point, because with some bonds, you may not, you think you're going to receive the interest payment, but if the company goes bankrupt, you're not going to receive all of those interest payments. So our computation is based on the perception of receiving the interest payments and the par value when the bond matures.
I'm still also kind of confused on the thing, if it's 1134, but then the future value is 1,000, how it's just because the interest rate is high enough that
Yeah.
it makes it.
For this bond, okay. Let's say we start here at 10%, the required return of 10% at $1,000. Okay, this bond is paying currently at 10% interest. Okay, now if rates go down to 8%, what happens is the price. Now keep in mind, we're focusing on this bond, because if rates go down to 8%, this bond's paying 10%. An investor, if they want this 10% coupon bond, they're going to have to pay a premium for it. And the reason is, nobody would buy the 8% coupon bond for $1,000 if they could buy a 10% coupon bond for $1,000. So since interest rates went down, the price of the bond on the open market is forced up, because investors now, if they buy this bond for $1134.20, they're paying a premium for it, which doesn't seem very smart, but they're earning not 8%, but they're still earning a 10% rate of interest, so they're earning more in interest. And the yield on a bond is made up of two factors, the interest rate yield and the capital gain or capital loss yield. So in this case, you would have a capital loss because the bond is going to go from $1134.20 to $1,000. You're going to lose $134.20. But the additional interest income over the life of the bond makes up for that capital loss. Now, in this situation where interest rates go up, the exact opposite occurs. You look at this and you think, wow, I'm getting a deal. I can buy this $1,000 bond for $887, and I'm going to make $113 in a capital gain when I buy this bond. The problem is interest rates are now 12%. Your bond's only paying 10%. So you're earning 2 percentage points less than a brand new bond that's selling right now. But because you're earning less interest, you get a capital gain, and the combination of the capital gain and the lower interest means you're going to earn exactly the market rate of interest, which is 10%. Well, actually, in this case, if they went up to 12, it's 12%. No more and no less. So what this is saying is interest rates have to change so that you can't beat the market when it comes to investing in bonds. Does that help any? This is always a tough one. After the second test, you go into bond valuation. That's always a tough sell, okay? I've been trying to sell this for years now. It's always hard. You think you looked at this enough, okay? Once your brains start working again, if you looked at this enough, that it would make some sense to you. Or if nothing else, can you just memorize that if interest rates go down, bond prices go up, and if interest rates go up, bond prices go down? Okay? I mean, that's all I'm asking of you. You don't have to go in and theoretically explain to me why it's happening, just as long as you know that there's a negative relationship between bond prices and interest rate. And this is the same thing. This is just in Excel that'll show you what's happening here, and again, you got the same prices here. And this is also showing this graph is probably in every finance book ever written. It simply shows you what happens as the required return goes up, and so you can watch the price of the bond go down, which is what we've been talking about. Okay. All right, so let's see, where are we here? Hang on, let me see where we are. Okay, that's a good stopping point for today. All right, so we're gonna stop here. When we pick up on Thursday, we're going to start talking about yield to maturity, which is another calculation. We're going to look at bond ratings. We may actually be able to start into chapter 7 Thursday, which is stock valuation. So everybody have a good day. Also, let me remind you, I've had some of you see me, but since registration is coming up and advising is going on, if any of you have an interest in finance or would like to know, okay, what if I change my major or whatever, had a few of you come see me already, but if you're interested in that, come see me. We can do a what if analysis to see how long it would take you to graduate. And also, we can talk about careers and jobs in the finance area. So just make an appointment with me and come see me. Have a good day. I will see you on Thursday.